as an outsider, say as a vendor trying to sell, you need to understand the dynamic between the business side and the cyber side and how you can leverage that to really have better partnerships with the people you sell to, rather than I have a cool tool and I hope you guys think it's cool and allocate the money.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast. Today, I have a special guest, Mike Gable. I met Mike almost 20 years ago. Time flies at Trend Micro. Mike built and ran every type of customer-facing team, including technical support, consulting, sales engineering, customer success, and sales. Mike worked around the world for companies including Trend Micro, Bitfender, Malwarebytes, and few other early-stage startups. Hey, Mike, welcome to Cutting Through the Noise podcast. What are you working on these days?
So I'm, after about 30 plus years of working for cybersecurity and technology vendors, I hung up my travel bag, and these days I do a little consulting, a little teaching, and a little writing. I wrote and published a book for business people about cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I know you wrote the Executive Cybersecurity Advisor, and having read the book, I find it very timely. As the cybersecurity market, as I'm sure you know, that is shifting and maturing, and there seems to be a growing need to simplify what businesses truly need. And as a result, that requires a completely different approach, both from the many vendors presenting their value, as well as how CISOs need to justify their spend. So if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about the book and really what drove you to now become a book author.
Okay. So I'd always thought, it'd be good to write a book based on the experiences that, a lot of the stuff you and I were through. But the book kind of went in a different direction. So what happened was I was having dinner with my brother-in-law, and he's the CEO of a biotech company here in Florida. And he was concerned about his cybersecurity. He said that he understands how much he spends, but nothing else. And he said that he was nervous about ransomware. And he asked his head of cybersecurity, "Are we protected?" And the gentleman said, "Oh, we've got great protection. Don't worry about it." And I told my brother that, that's not the right question. I said, the right question, you want to have some protection, that's good. But ransomware is something that's kind of, you can't be 100% sure it won't happen. So the question about ransomware is not, are you protected against it? And that's good that you are. The question is, if you get hit with a ransomware attack, how quickly can you be back in business? And that's a question that a lot of business people and some cyber people don't really get into. And so I told my brother-in-law, I said, what I can do is I can write a book explaining everything you need to know about cybersecurity. And he said, well, you got to keep it short. I said, okay, I'll make it an article. It was too long for an article. And he said, and it can't have any jargon, no acronyms and weird terms. So I kept the book to around 60 pages in the Kindle format. The other formats are a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. And I didn't use any acronyms that I didn't explain. And the idea was to simplify the world of cybersecurity so that a business person could understand it and could have a productive conversation with their cybersecurity people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just a few weeks ago, I came back from Black Hat and seeing basically on the business floor, hundreds of different cybersecurity companies, all using different terms, jargon terms, technical terms. And I can only imagine a CISO stepping into that cage and how they probably feel about all of those different messages coming their way, especially when they need to translate that into business terms that their organization can actually understand. So that definitely makes sense. So my question here is, how did you simplify all of the cyber terms? And I read your book, so I probably know the answer. Highly recommend to anyone to take to read the book. But how did you simplify all of the cyber terms so that any business person can truly understand it?
Well, I started with a simple premise. So back when you and I worked for Trend Micro, we talked about creating a 2.0 CISO. And the idea was you would have a CISO who was also an MBA. They could understand the business, they could read a financial statement, and they could do that and be a CISO. Now, I still like the idea, and I have a friend who's a CISO who is actually, very business focused and very technically focused. So that's one part. But I thought the problem with the CISO 2.0 idea is that the business side, the CFO, the CEO, the chief auditor, these people don't have any understanding of cybersecurity. So I simplified cybersecurity specifically for that audience, and I boiled it down to 3 disciplines. And the disciplines are prevention, detection, and response. And so the idea is this is what you're paying for. If you're the CEO of a large company, or really any company, you're paying for prevention. You have to buy some degree of prevention, because without it, you're going to be overwhelmed with attacks. In the cyber world, we call this the attack surface. What are you doing to mitigate the risks around your attack surface? That's prevention. But we know in cyber that prevention can never be 100%. I was actually surprised that many people in the business side, they believe that prevention, if you spend enough, you can get to 100% prevention. So not quite. Next is detection. You have to be able to detect the stuff that prevention didn't stop. You want it the sooner, the better. And if any part of your attack surface is compromised or gets hit, you want to know. So do we have enough detection? If somebody logged in as the CEO into our Active Directory, would we know about it? If somebody impersonated him, how quickly? And then we get to the third thing that you buy as an executive, and that's response. If prevention fails, and it eventually will, and detection maybe gives you a head start, but response is probably the most business critical piece. If we think about ransomware, if we can prevent it, great. But we can only prevent, say, 95 to 98% of all ransomware attacks. Eventually, given enough time, a ransomware attack will probably get through. And the key question then is, how does your team respond? And the response is not technical. It's not, can we identify the malware? No. It's how quickly can you get back to work, ideally without paying the ransom. And so from a business perspective, I said, if you understand those 3 things, you have the basic understanding of cyber. How much are we spending on prevention? How much are we spending on detection? And how much are we spending on response? And you can ask the key questions I put in the book to understand on those 3 levels. So I try to keep it as basic as possible.
Oh, this is great. It really reminds me of the cybersecurity framework from NIST, but this is really the business version of that same framework at the higher level. So have you received any feedback on these concepts that you presented in the book from
I got
book
some
readers, CISOs, business leaders, etc.?
Yeah, I got positive feedback from business people. A few people noticed that this is similar to the way that medicine works. I hadn't thought of that. But if you go to the doctor, he'll tell you, eat right, exercise, in my case, lose weight. This is prevention. Now, in addition to that, my doctor will recommend some tests. That's detection. And if they find something, that's response. And so, really, it's not a radical new thing. Prevention, detection, and response is something you find in medicine, you find it in fire prevention. And so, business people felt that, hey, you gave me something that I can understand easily, even if I don't know the details. Now, my cyber expert friends felt the book wasn't written for them, which it really wasn't. It was aimed at business people. And one of the CISOs that I had read the book for me, they said that the biggest challenge they face is when they go into board meetings on a quarterly basis, and the CEOs and CFOs want the answers to two questions. And the questions are, what's the likelihood of a major breach, in the next quarter or in the next year? And the harder one, how much will that breach cost so that we can be prepared? Now, the cyber insurance business will not insure anybody really over $100 million. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to get. So a company has to be prepared financially if a breach, say, is going to cost them 300 or 400 million. If they're not prepared, they could end up going out of business. And so my CISO friends wanted that added to the book, and it's something that I may look at, for a future book, or kind of if I do a version 2 of this book. But breach probability and breach costing is a brand new field. There's really only 2 ways to accomplish it. There's a methodology that's been pushed by the big ProServe firms called FAIR, and it stands for Factor Analysis of Information Risk. And it's a never-ending professional services engagement that gives you useful information after about 8 months to a year. And then there's a company called X Analytics out of the DC area, and they claim they do it much faster, but it's a newer methodology. But the idea of getting the CFOs the answer to those business questions is interesting and something I may look at downrange. But yeah, that was the feedback I got. The business people felt good framework, good way to have conversations. And my tech friends pointed out, hey, here's a piece we could use to build the bridge between cyber and business.
Right. That's very interesting. The ability to quantify from business perspective a breach and basically an impact, because it's not just the cost of remediation, but there's all kinds of costs around the breach that potentially have severe financial impact. And then the question is, how do you deploy the right strategy or strategies that are relevant to those risks, rather than basically, having a cybersecurity strategy that may or may not be tied into a business outcome or a business impact. One other question I want to ask you that brings up, when I'm thinking about cost of breach and analytics, I've used, and I'm sure you did as well over the years, white papers from the Ponemon Institute around cost of breach. Yep. The DBIR report, every year there's a new DBIR report. Everybody likes to quote that report. It talks about the probability of a breach based on a specific threat type, whether it's ransomware, forecasting for the next year, and so on. And I'm curious if you mentioned that you have some thoughts about next release or maybe an updated version of the book, but are you thinking, or how are you thinking about covering a breach costs in your next book or article or whatever you have in mind?
Well, my exposure to breach costing, it started a few years ago. So when Equifax was breached, which I think was 2021, thereabouts, um, one of the founders of X Analytics, the company that I mentioned, tweeted that the hard cost of the Equifax breach was going to be 1.35 billion. And he was blasted on Twitter because people felt that was outrageous. It was too high. Now, the key thing is he said hard costs. Now, I have a lot of accountants in my family. And so to them, hard costs are, quantifiable. It's not, oh, our brand is damaged. No, no, no. It's your sales went down 20%, quantifiable hard costs. Well, it turns out, as of last year, the Equifax breach cost Equifax in hard costs 1.347 billion. So this guy's guess, which was built on the modeling tool they built, was really close. And so I got to know the folks at X Analytics, and they have a pretty cool solution. And then I learned about FAIR, which is a very detailed professional services engagement that takes a lot of time. But those methodologies were the starting point. What I found interesting was in researching the book, I talked to some chief audit executives, CAEs. And what I learned was they want not a static number, but they want to know if we could have a breach in the next 12 months and the worst case cost of that breach is, say, $1 billion, what investment can we make that gives us the fastest ROI to, say, reduce that $1 billion to $750 million? In other words, can we spend 10 mil to reduce our potential risk from $1 billion to 750? That has a $250 billion risk reduction tied to it. And while there are some CISOs very interested in doing that, it's still very, very new. And so I'm keeping an eye on what happens with the business. I think if the chief auditors have more say over cybersecurity, that will become front and center sooner. And so I'm not really sure what direction to take, say a book or an article on that subject, because it's still very, very much in its infancy. But what I may do is I may write an article or two just to see what feedback I get, and then have some conversations with some auditors and some CISOs and see if we're getting to the point where we can start seriously looking at this as something that needs to be addressed. As you know, the big problem in cyber is we're so busy putting out the daily fires, dealing with a huge alert volume, that the idea of, hey, we can quantify our worst case breach, and now we want to see what investments can we make that reduce that worst case breach. That's a multi-billion-dollar issue, because today insurance companies can't figure out how to make money in cyber. They don't understand how to predict. All that cyber insurance companies have done is lose money. So it's one of the reasons why you can't really get cyber insurance above 100 to 125 million. And imagine you're one of the big banks. Your cybersecurity exposure runs between 5 and 7 billion from some of the white papers I've read. It'd be great to get insurance, but they can't. They can only get 100 million. Equifax only had 125 million, and they ended up paying 1.34 billion. Luckily, they were able to amortize that over 10 years, but there are organizations where that sort of punishment, that sort of financial hit, is an extinction level event. And because of that reason, I think you're going to see an acceleration in breach costing, breach prediction in the next few years. So, we'll see where it goes.
Right. Now, the theme of this episode is cutting through the noise, because there's so many vendors out there. As I mentioned earlier, even going to Black Hat was quite an experience. There were 420 something vendors, many of them basically using the same messaging, the same terms. So I'm curious, based on your feedback and where you would like to take this framework or mindset forward, how do you see this helping CISOs or businesses to pick the right tools, and how potentially cybersecurity vendors can work with CISOs and maybe other business sponsors to better align what they need, so that it's not just about going after the next XDR, MDR, EDR, whatever is fashionable, but really tying that to a real business outcome, making an impact that can get quantified, and making sure that that's also communicated in a way that is digestible by the business. And that's really kind of what I'm thinking. That's what I loved about the book. That's why I got excited and I reached out to you, because I'm thinking this is really where the market has to go. Cybersecurity is maturing, and we can no longer sell on features, benefits, cool terms or cool demos, cool products. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts about that?
So part of the reason that I wrote the book is that when I was talking to financial people, I started with my brother-in-law, as I mentioned, and I talked to some CFOs and some chief auditors. The gap between their world and our world in cyber is huge. They don't understand what we do. And I think to a big extent, we in cyber don't really understand what they do. I mean, it's easy to say, for me as a cyber guy to go, well, a CFO's job is to make sure the money flows. Well, one of the auditors, he was a retired auditor who had worked for RJ Reynolds, and he told me that the scariest thing for financial people is that IT has kind of gotten out of control. Nobody who rolled out websites and automation understood that they were incurring a potential risk that could destroy their business. A big breach today could be so expensive it destroys the business. Nobody thought that 25 years ago when this started out. And so I see that there's a big gap. And on one side, cybersecurity people, which mostly that's my background, we talk about the technical issues. And on the other hand, you have the financial people who are talking about the lifeblood of the company, which ultimately is money. One of the things that I learned is that CEOs have a term called cyber poverty. I'd never heard this. Some CEOs believe that unless your company is $50 million or more in revenue, you can't afford cybersecurity. It's just a matter of time before an attack destroys you and runs you out of business. And they don't know what to do. They're scared. And so the biggest challenge I see is that there's a big gap. Often it's between the CISO and maybe the board or the CEO. That's kind of where it comes to pass. Now, as a VP of sales for tech companies, I had a few deals, and I'm sure everybody's seen this, where the CISO is our buddy. He's signed off. They're ready to spend money. And somehow it doesn't happen. And what I learned researching the book is part of the reason it doesn't happen is that the business side feels that the cyber side doesn't really make a good case. One auditor, or chief audit executive, told me every time I ask the cyber guy, the CISO, how much money do you need? The answer is always more. It's not a finite amount. Now, part of that is because we're a maturing field. We haven't gotten there yet. But the other piece is because there are so many solutions, and we like to sell the newest thing. And the newest thing buys. Cybersecurity is very fashion focused. And I was surprised talking to some of these folks that solutions that we in cyber consider old, like EDR, are still being rolled out. EDR is, 8 years old at least? It went mainstream almost 10 years ago. And there are companies whose their rollout is 30, 40% done. And so if you look at a new technology, like all the stuff that came out of, XDR, NDR, all of those things, the large scale implementations of that are 2, 3, 4 years out. And we're focused on that rather than sitting down with the business and having kind of that question of, all right, what's the worst case breach? How much would that cost? And what investment could we make to reduce that possible cost? That really gets to the heart of the business. So in a way, I guess what I'm saying is when I was the VP of sales for technology companies, I sold on, hey, our stuff is better than the competitor. This is good protection. But I never took it to this is why it matters to your business. And I think ultimately the companies that will succeed will be the ones that can get across that gap between the CISO and the CEO or the board and explain, my solution is not just a really cool data lake for your events. It is a way to reduce the probability, or better yet, the cost of a future breach. That way you're making an investment in saving your company, a quantifiable investment, ideally. That's still, it's an idea I've been kicking around for a while, and it may turn into something, but for now, I'm just kind of observing it.
Yeah, that's great. So speaking of simplification, where do you see, and this is, everybody's talking about AI, generative AI, LLMs, and so on. Where do you see generative AI potentially helping to simplify cybersecurity as like you just described it, as really a business driver, positive business driver, and maybe even a revenue generator rather than just another cost center?
Yeah, I'm very excited about the potential of generative AI, the large language models. I see some really amazing possibilities. Now, first thing is I'm not subscribing to some of the crazier things I've read. I read, with AI, we won't need lawyers anymore because all the contracts will be done automatically. I don't think so. Or we won't need screenwriters because AI will write a good screenplay. I don't know. It's very hard for humans to write a good screenplay. I don't think so. I used it to translate parts of my book into Spanish because I'm not that good at it, but I have relatives who want the book in Spanish, so I may use it for that. And it's good for that. But I see the potential in AI as being a tool that, if used correctly, could be hugely transformative. And so there are 3 huge problems in cybersecurity today, and AI could potentially fix them. I don't see any other way of fixing them. The first problem is orchestrating and coordinating all the different solutions required to protect an organization. The typical CISO has, 30 to 80 different products. They each have configurations, consoles, and they each gather information about how the organization is protected. Today, we try to have humans coordinate all that, and even with the biggest teams, it's not workable. With AI, you could have one set of policies across multiple products, and you could collect all of the data. So it would be a combination of the orchestration that we see today and the SIMs just kind of bunched into one thing. I know there's a couple of companies that are experimenting with this, but I think potentially generative AI could make the managing of the AI universe, or the cyber universe, simpler. Now, that's going to take a few years to get there, but I think that's good. Now, the next thing are the detection issues. So detection is a double problem for most organizations. First, most organizations don't have complete detection. There are things that can be attacked in the organization that they don't detect. And even though they're not detecting everything, they're overwhelmed by the number of alerts and the number of log entries that need checking. When incident response teams were first built, the idea was that an incident response engineer would look at 10 to 20 incidents or alerts a day. I've talked to organizations where the typical incident response person gets 300 or 400 alerts. They ignore most of them. Well, AI has the horsepower to look at all of the alerts, to look at, hey, what parts of our system need alerting that we don't have, so they can actually complete the alert surface, as Forrester calls it, or sorry, detection surface, as Forrester calls it, to match the attack surface. And it could look at all of the alerts and make a decision. Now, if we tackle those two problems, if we're able to orchestrate all the different tools, that will make cyber more accessible and more powerful for everybody. If we've solved the detection issues, the next question is, can we leverage AI for response? Can it undo the damage caused by some cyber attacks? Response is the most time-consuming part of most of the cyber response processes, or response is the most time-consuming item, more so than prevention or detection. If you have 100 machines that are infected, that can take a substantial amount of time. And there are some automated tools, but none of them are 100% effective. Could AI make that better? I think so. So I think AI has a tremendous promise, but it isn't simply, hey, let's take the AI tools we have today, which have some really cool capabilities in terms really of language. The LLMs are amazing, how they communicate, how they search, all those things are great. But we need to take the core of those solutions and build, the orchestration tool that can handle, enterprise security with 30 different disparate products, and then handle the detection issue, make sure we detect everything we need to detect, and that we don't ignore any of the alerts. We consider all of them. And then lastly, AI could make response more automated. So I think AI is really what cyber has been looking for 10 or 15 years. And once we realize that, I think cyber will be radically different. That's one of the cool things. You could join cyber today, and in 10 years, it will probably look nothing like it looks today. It's a field that's always reinventing itself. So, the knowledge of history and cyber, as somebody who's been in it a long time, is interesting trivia, but cybersecurity has always been more about the future than the past. We're always moving forward. And I think AI will be that next big step.
Yeah, definitely. So going back to the book, what would you say are the key takeaways that you would like readers to get from it?
Okay. So the main thing, Richard Feynman, the physicist, and Albert Einstein both said kind of the same thing. If you really understand something, you should be able to explain it to a fifth grader. That was Richard Feynman's quote. They both believe that if you truly understand something, you can explain it in simple terms. And so when I wrote the book, it seems easy in retrospect, but it was actually really hard because I was used to explaining cybersecurity to cybersecurity people or other technical people. And so I had to really distill it down. But the main takeaways from the book, I would say, is this is a primer or a primer, depending how you pronounce that word, for business people to understand cyber. And we talked a little bit before about the CISO 2.0, a CISO who understands business. Well, this book's intention is to create a CEO 2.0 or a chief auditor or CFO 2.0 who understands enough about cyber to ask the right questions. Cybersecurity needs simplification because we are so focused on our own field that we make it very difficult for smart people from other fields to understand what we're about. Now, some of that was, to keep out the uninitiated, but I think at this point in our evolution, it's important that cyber have an open door where we have transparency and, financial people can see what we're up to. So the idea is That's the main piece. Teach business people about cyber. Now, conversely, the CISOs that I talk to, and this may be something I'll add to the 2.0 version of the book, I should also try to help build the bridge in the other direction. CISOs don't need to know the job of the CFO. They don't need to know everything about finance, but they need to know enough about that. And as an outsider, say as a vendor trying to sell, you need to understand the dynamic between the business side and the cyber side and how you can leverage that to really have better partnerships with the people you sell to, rather than I have a cool tool and I hope you guys think it's cool and allocate the money. It's you're allocating the money because it's good for your business. It's a better survival, or ideally makes you a more profitable company.
This is great. So, Mike, I really appreciate your insights. And for those that are listening and they may want to get in touch with you, what is the best way to connect with you?
Okay, I'm on LinkedIn as Michael Gable, and it's probably the easiest. Or you can email me at mgable, MGABLE, at semethods.com. That's S as in sales, E as in engineering, methods, methods.com. semethods.com was a company, or I guess still is an LLC that I use for some consulting.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. It was a pleasure hosting you. Thank you so much.
No, thanks, Alan. I really appreciate it.